Hello and welcome. My name is Manuel Quintana with Pragmatic Works. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about working with Fabric and powerapps, bringing these two worlds together. Mainly, we're looking at talking about some of the roadblocks you may have encountered and some options that you might want to discover on how you might be able to work around those. But it really depends on what you're trying to do with powerapps. For the most part, right, when we're thinking about powerapps, there's a couple scenarios depending on what you're trying to get from your app. But good news is, if you're really just trying to do something with powerapps, create a Canvas app or something here where it's really just from a read-only perspective, then to be honest, everything's on the table for you, right? If read-only is what you want to do, then you're good to go. And we're going to look at some of the options, right? Either just a Canvas app where you can just go ahead and point. As we're going to see, there's a virtual table option. We'll talk about that in a little bit. There is just a, from external data connection option. We'll talk about that as well. We're going to explore these various things. But good thing is, if you're trying to read only, then you're golden. What happens though if we're trying to do an app where we can read, but also potentially update and then of course create new records, write data, right? If that's what we want to do. Generally, we're going to be seeing patches and updates and things such as that. What are our options in that space? So first, let's discuss what we have available to us within Fabric itself. So if we look and explore, of course, we're talking about the Lakehouse, we're talking about the warehouse, and we're talking about SQL Database. Now, the important thing is the SQL Database, which is in preview at the time of this recording, is maybe something you haven't looked into because it's in a preview state. Also, it should be noted, of course, with how often and fast Fabric changes, that the content in this video will, of course, update this if it changes, but it's always just moving so quick. So there could be amendments to this, and we'll make sure we update that. When we talk about lakehouses, right, this is kind of an initial area where a lot of people go into. We know that that experience when it comes to things like the SQL endpoint is very much a read-only experience, right? So there is no create statements or alter statements. That will come into play here as we look at this. But quick answer, real quick, if you're going to try to get data and use data from a lakehouse in Power Apps, you're really only going to be able to do read-only scenarios within that app itself, right? So the next option we have, of course, is the warehouse. Now, the warehouse effectively turns on way more capability from the SQL endpoint perspective. We can use create statements, we can use alter statements, and most importantly, right, we can define a primary key on the table, which is something that a Power Apps is going to require in order to have the write back capability. So that being said, we have a Fabric warehouse. It lets us define a key, but if we look into it, that key at the moment now has to be used with a couple of keywords. Those keywords are going to be not enforced and non-clustered. That seems to be an issue. So unfortunately, you're thinking, okay, well, Power Apps didn't let me do it with the Lakehouse. I find I need a key column here. So let's go to the warehouse and let's define that, right? You have your create statement. You have to make sure the column's not null. And then you can use an alter with the non-clustered, not enforced keywords. Unfortunately, this still does not suffice. In scenarios where you're trying to do update a record or write, which I will show you, you are unable to accomplish it. So once again, even for the warehouse, we're left with kind of a read-only scenario for the Power Apps itself. But then that leads us to the third option, the newest member on the block, if you will. It's going to be Fabric SQL Databases. Now this, effectively being a managed Azure SQL database in the background, allows us, of course, to use create statements, alter statements, and we can define a primary key, and it does not require the non-clustered, not enforced, which the Fabric warehouse did. And because of this, this is going to be your option if you want to create an app, a Power App, right, that's connecting to data in Fabric and have the capability not just to read, but also potentially write back. At the moment, Fabric SQL Databases is really going to be your only option. So that's what we're going to be focused on. We'll show all the different scenarios here so you can see this. But if you haven't looked at it and that's what you're looking to accomplish with Power Apps, this is really where you probably want to be until potentially it's supported. And I would imagine, this is merely conjecture, but I would imagine that potentially in the future, maybe the warehouse will support potentially write back capability from Power Apps. But until that moment arrives, Fabric databases or SQL databases within Fabric is what you're going to be interested in. What are our options here? Of course, you can just go into an app. When you're in Power Apps, you can go ahead and just say, hey, I want to create a connection from an external source. We'll look into that. When you hit external source, you're not going to really discover a Fabric option for you there. As of this recording, maybe that does appear and come around, but when you hit those connections, you don't see Fabric explicitly. But what we do have, which a Lakehouse has, a warehouse has, as well as a database has in Fabric, the SQL endpoint. So you can leverage the SQL connector in Power Apps to connect to any of these three types of storage options that Fabric offers us, right? And there is another option, which is going to be virtual tables. And that's what we see here on the screen. So virtual tables does have an option for Fabric. Now, at the time of this recording, when we use that option and we connect, we can only see lakehouses and warehouses. And as we've discussed, both of those options don't give us write back capability. So even though virtual tables at the core of it does allow for read and write operations happening in real time to whatever the external source we kind of create as part of the virtual table, it is only going to be from a read perspective. But it's a cool little option. If you know you only have a read-only scenario for your Power App, Virtual Tables provides an easy option. Just put in your information, just specify the workspace. It'll give you a list of your available objects. Once again, all lakehouses and warehouses in that workspace. And then you can choose the table that you're interested in. Very simple, very quick, very fast. And of course, we will look at that process together. Couple things we can go to. Let's actually start with the setup, right? So I'm going to sneak away from the slide deck and I'm going to go into my Fabric environment. Now, as part of this, we are going to provide you you can see some scripts and some credentials. Let me explain how we're going to do this, because as you can see, this is probably a part in the video where you may want to pause, as I already have a lakehouse, a warehouse, and a database already provisioned. The data has been loaded in. That data is coming from an Azure SQL database that is publicly available. So you can see that in the resources, there is a Pragmatic Works Azure SQL DB credentials. This contains everything you're going to need, which is going to be the server name. It's going to be the database name. And of course, the username and password, which only has read-only access. Because as you can imagine, we don't want people directly adjusting the records in this public available source. This is all here. And that is being leveraged inside each of these pipelines. All right. In this case, this is the one that's loading my SQL database. You can see it's loading my lakehouse. It's loading my warehouse, but simply, and I can just go into one of these because it's literally the exact same pipeline, simply that the destination has been changed. So if you see one of these, you should be able to apply this logic to all three. Of course, if you want to use data flows or something else to load these artifacts, the lakehouse, the warehouse, and the database, that's up to you. That's perfectly fine. But you can see my source, once again, is using that connection information. Nothing too crazy. Literally, it's got the server name right there. It's going to have the database name, which you specify in the database right here. And once again, you would put in the respective PW student and that credential in here. So you simply configure this connection to that publicly available Azure SQL database. And then your destination, in this case, since we're pointing, this is my warehouse pipeline, you can see I've simply pointed to the warehouse. And you notice I'm saying existing table. This can be a really important thing just to be aware. If you choose to auto create the table, or you use, let's say in the data flow, and you use the overwrite option there, when you do this for a warehouse, remember it's effectively dropping the table and recreating it if you do that. So this can be a problem. If you take the time and you've created a table in the warehouse, and this potentially could be an issue also with the database, but if you wrote a create statement, you have an alter in there and you got it all set, when you do an overwrite, there's nothing inside the data flow that basically tells us to define a primary key on, in our case, the ID column. So it's just literally going to drop the table. It's going to recreate it, but there won't be a key, which for the sake of Power Apps is concerned, it actually doesn't matter because that not enforced non-cluster just doesn't allow for write back anyways for Power Apps, but it could obviously impact other things. So just be aware of that. In this case, you can see I'm using existing because once again, we have provided you with the scripts. Notice in here, there's a Fabric database creation script. There's a warehouse creation script. So all you need to do is open up this corresponding file, go into your warehouse in question and literally just paste this query in, right? You can see I have the query already here. It's saved, but literally I pasted that in from the text file. You can run this and now you've created this table in the warehouse. You can of course do this for the Fabric SQL database as well. Run the script, create it, and simply point to those as destinations. So with that out of the way, couple pipelines, couple destination tables, run them, and then the data loads in. It's a very simple set of 100 records, nothing fancy. This video, of course, is not focused around pipelines, data flows, that stuff. We're just looking at the functionality with Power Apps. So if you want to pause, rewatch this, public data, just loading it into these respective areas. Naturally, the Lakehouse doesn't allow for the create statement. So what that one naturally is just creating a new object from within the pipeline. So I just created a new element, ran it, and it took the schema. Remember, we can't define keys in there anyway, so it doesn't matter. So I have now 3 items. Each one of these all has the same table just loaded in. Of course, we've taken into account for the warehouse to define the key, and we've gone ahead inside the database and defined the key there with the respective either restrictions or not restrictions, right? Once again, the warehouse restricted to using not enforced, non-clustered, but the database isn't. There's no restriction here. Standard primary key, and you don't need those keywords. So we've got the data. Let's go over here and say, well, how can I get and use this data inside of powerapps, right? So we'll head over. We can see I'm just logged into powerapps itself. I'm in my environments. And the first thing you can do, right, is we're going to talk about virtual tables, is we can go over here to the tables section and we can go ahead and hit new table, and you can see virtual table. Here, we're going to see that we have quite a few options. And the one we're interested in is Microsoft Fabric. If you haven't set this up, it's just going to use it's going to use your organizational credentials. So you go in, you just log in with your account, the same account you're logged in with PowerApps. So it's probably going to do single sign-on, just authenticate if you have MFA. And you'll notice when you do this, it will actually also authenticate your SQL Server connection. So notice SQL Server is also there. It actually does both of these because remember, and this is going to come into play later, Lakehouses, warehouses, and SQL databases all have SQL endpoints, right? The Lakehouse is kind of a very explicit thing, whereas the warehouse and the database, they are the SQL endpoints. Well, technically, the database has its own specific one as well. But there's ways through a SQL endpoint to connect to all three options, and that'll come into play later on. But realistically, if you know you have a table in play, a single table that you're interested in, this can be a nice, easy option. So if I go in and choose Fabric, we can go ahead and hit next. It tells me, okay, using those credentials, what workspace do you want to connect to? We can see here, I'm hitting the drop down. I'm going to choose this one. I created a workspace specifically for this, and then it's going to present to me. It says Microsoft Fabric Lakehouse, but interestingly enough, you will view any and all lakehouses and warehouses. You can see them both here. And for the sake of argument, to really kind of test this out, let's do the Lakehouse first so you can see, once again, this is going to be a read-only perspective, right? It's not going to allow write back. I can hit next. It simply asks me what table in that lakehouse do we want. I'm just going to choose the one that we have available. And you can see it's going to choose a display name. In this case, I don't really need to because I'm only going to do one of these virtual tables. Once again, the behavior will be exactly the same. Should we do this for a warehouse, it is still going to be read only. But if I would put like a little LH here. If I was going to do both of these, you don't really have to. And you can see it asks for a primary field. If you're unfamiliar with like Dataverse and tables, this is not like, you can see I can't choose my ID column. It's not really meant to portray that. We're looking for generally a GUID or a text string here that describes this table. So I'm just going to leave it as customer name. And I'm going to go ahead and hit next and just basically create this virtual table. Now this does stay in sync, right? So if the actual table in the Lakehouse, if you do something, if you run a pipeline, a data flow, if you run a notebook and you do adjust, add rows, remove rows, update them through that fashion, that will be represented here in this virtual table. So it's pretty cool how that functions. So once again, if you just need to make it, this is nice, built in, works seamlessly. You can see I have all 100 records here. I'm just going to sort this so we can see from one. I'm sorted on the ID, right? But it's all in here, 100 records. So let's see how we can put this into play. And once again, kind of showcase to you where the issue comes in here. If I go just to create, I'm going to go ahead and choose this start with data. So it just really quickly makes an app for me. We're not going to focus on app development and creation. Don't forget, we have an app in a day. We've got a Fabric analyst in a day. If you want to dive into each of these topics more in depth, check those out definitely. But we're going to see here, I'm going to choose, since I have a virtual table, I'm going to select an existing table. I'm going to locate my Galactic sales. You can see it tells me it's a virtual table and it's good. I'm going to create the app and very quickly it creates this very simple app, which is built out in a way to allow potentially for updates and inserts. That's the way this is designed. Just really fast, very quick, just to get you going, which is great in a lot of scenarios. But what we're going to see here is it's not going to allow us to do writes. So in this case, updates or news or even deletes. So I'm going to go ahead and just skip this. Let's go ahead and sample this. I mean, you can see right away. I mean, it's got from a read-only perspective, I can see this. It gives me the details here, which is great, right? And the idea is, well, you know what? Let me update this. So let's say I want to go ahead and update Mr. Finn here, and I'm going to put my own name, Manuel, right? So we go ahead, I'm going to push this update through, and we're going to see that we get an error message. This cannot save. Please check if there are errors in the form. And when we return back to the form itself, go here, we can see that we have an error message. It should be here. Let's see here. We'll go to the error itself. You can see there's an issue using the patch function, and you can see the request operation is invalid, right? It doesn't give us full scope and specification, but once again, we will not have write capability here. There's a problem. Once again, we actually can't even identify like the key columns. So it's going to be an issue. You're not going to be able to perform this. And this is the submission of the form. So this would affect basically any sort of deletes, updates, and new record entries. None of these things will function and will work. This kind of shows us the Lakehouse is out, the warehouses is out. This would perform the exact same thing regardless of what you decide to use. If you only need read-only, use a virtual table. If you need to combine data from multiple tables and possibly using the SQL endpoint, which we're going to do here momentarily, could be a great option. But let's look at what allows for write capabilities. I'm going to go ahead and simply leave this app. We're not going to save it, right? And we're going to dive into now connecting to the Fabric SQL database, right? We're going to start in the same way. We're going to go ahead and say, I'm going to create a new app. We're going to start with data. And this time around, I am actually going to go over here and say, I'm going to connect to external data, because obviously we only have that one virtual table. As we talked about, as of right now, virtual tables cannot connect to the SQL database option of Fabric. Maybe it does in the future. And if that becomes available through virtual tables, right? If you just need to point to one table and that's what you're interested for your app, that possibly could be an interesting option, because there's a possibility we may be able to read and write just for the SQL database. But let's go ahead and do external data, because that option isn't there now. And we can see, of course, we have lots of different options for sources, right? You can go in and you can create new sources if you wanted to. I mean, you can add more and more and more. In our case, right, I'm going to go here and go from SQL. Remember, when I made my connection, it kind of authenticated my SQL server already. So it's asking for a server name, a database name, and then we can select a table. And as mentioned, technically, you can do this for your Lakehouse, for your warehouse, and your database. Just remember, if you do it for the Lakehouse and the warehouse, you're still in the same scenario. It's going to be for read-only situations for apps. But, and I'll show you where you can see this, right? The Lakehouse, you can come right in here. Actually, if you go to the SQL endpoint of the Lakehouse, so let me go to the Lakehouse, SQL endpoint, you can see there's this option that says open in. A very easy way to get this information, right? There is your server name. There is your database name. This same exact option can be found in the warehouse. Open in, there you go. This is going to be the same information, but you can just download it and you can use it. If I go over not to the SQL endpoint in the actual SQL database here within Fabric, if I go into the actual database object, you'll notice that right here, there's an open in. It's taking its time to load, but still, look at that database name there, all right? So in this scenario, if you want the ability to do that write back to this option, what you're going to need to do is, and let me get out of this old app here too, we'll save it. What you're going to want to do is ensure that you're going to the actual Fabric database object, not the SQL endpoint. The SQL endpoint is basically giving us the opportunity to query the data that lives in one lake using the Delta Parquet, which ends up having those same limitations we saw in the warehouse and the Lakehouse. So the connection string options, right? The server name, database name from the SQL endpoint of the Fabric SQL database won't work for you. Still stuck in a read-only scenario. But if we go to this Fabric object with, for some reason, the bringing up my database is taking a bit. Let me check here for fast. Let me just load it up. Technically, I don't need it to load, but here it is, right? To show the table. We got data in here. I want to show the right back here. So perfect. I'm going to go here, hit open in. We're going to copy this server name, which would be actually the same option there. I'm going to go with start with data, external, just like we kind of did before. I'm going to hit SQL, but this is once again where we're going to see a little bit different behavior. So I'm going to put in the server name. I'm going to go ahead and grab the database name, which, as I told you, different than the SQL endpoint. That's part of this Fabric artifact. And when I choose this, we let the app do its thing. We're going to see we have the same scenario where we're going to have a gallery. It shows my records. When I click on it, you get the detail screen. You can do those updates and there won't be any error messages, right? Then we can interact. So obviously, to kind of make this full statement come true, let's actually do it. I'm going to go ahead and simply start the app. We can see there's I'm just going to modify record 1, right? So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to just change it to my name. We'll just change from Leia to Manuel and we'll save it. So this is us testing the app. We can see it goes through, shows like it updated here. What about inside of the actual SQL database in Fabric? Well, we'll go ahead and refresh this. Actually, I need to run this query again here because this is just a preview of the screen, right? So I'll give it a second, reload that preview and take a look at that customer name. Manuel. So that's what we wanted to talk about. That's what we wanted to bring into the mix. You've got 3 choices, right? Let's bring this all home. We got 3 options in Fabric. We have a Lakehouse, we have a warehouse, we have a Fabric SQL database. Of the 3, as of right now, the only option, if you need write back capabilities in your Power App, is going to be the SQL database option within Fabric, and more specifically, making sure we use the connection info for the database object and not the SQL endpoint. A little bit sneaky, but hopefully in the future, maybe we see a bit more integration, a bit more capability. But this, once again, at the time of this recording is in preview mode, but maybe it's drawing more attention to you if Power Apps is something you really want to get involved with. But once again, if you're trying to do read-only scenarios with Power Apps, you got tons of choices there with the virtual tables. You could do the SQL endpoint. You do have a lot of options in that space. Maybe you've got some cool examples of how you've been kind of using other aspects of the Power Platform with Fabric. Maybe there's some fun things you're doing with either, Copilot Studio, maybe you're doing stuff with Power Automate, or even Power Apps itself. If so, make sure to put that information in the comments. Maybe we'll have some follow-up videos around that. This was hopefully showing you what you can do with Power Apps, all the limitations, and obviously how to make the most of it with read and write. As always, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.